Sandra, I got some applesauce for you. I was going to bring it tonight, but the couple would be like too much of I just go on and on.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming out in such large numbers. As I hope you all know, this is the Cornell Forensic Society's public debate on fracking. A debate we're holding for the second year in a row because we enjoyed the last one just so much. It is a pleasure to watch. What I'm going to do now is introduce to you our director, Professor Sam Nelson. He's a faculty member in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. Please give him a round of applause. Thank you. It's a pleasure to moderate this debate again for the second year. One thing that Cornell Forensic Society tries to do, we're the speech and debate team for Cornell University, is we try to promote public debate about controversial issues, and so that we can discuss these hot issues with a sense of decorum and civility, because we believe civil discourse is important. Unfortunately, on many controversial issues, and this may be one of them, that's very difficult to do sometimes. So we think that this is a safe space for exactly that kind of event. And the members of the Cornell Forensic Society and the Cornell community are going to do everything they can to do as, to promote what Desmond Tutu, this is the quote we have on the back of our new t-shirt, that says, it's a quote from Desmond Tutu, it says, instead of raising your voice, improve your argument. And that's sort of the spirit that we're holding today's debate. So without further ado, I want to start the debate as soon as possible. I'd like the president of the Cornell Forensic Society, Kirat Singh, to come up and explain the format. Then what I will do is there will be a flip of the coin. But before we do that, I think I'd like each member of today's debate to just introduce themselves for about a minute, kind of tell us why they are a stakeholder in today's debate. Why are you here? And why do you think it's important to participate in today's debate? So please introduce yourself and tell us why you're here. I'll start on this end.
I am John Conrad. I am a geologist. I work for a company called P.D. Scheffler with offices in New York and Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh area. I myself have lived in New York since the late 1980s. I am also a member of the Independent Oil and Gas Association. I'm part of their public outreach committee, and that's one of the things that brings me here today.
We can't hear you. Can't hear you.
For purpose of disclosure, my company is an engineering and environmental consulting firm. We also do surveying, and we work for a wide range of clients, institutions, and private and public clients. And some of them are energy companies and pipeline companies involved in development of Marcellus shale. Early in my career, I worked as a petroleum geologist. I also worked in the petrochemical industry, working on waste disposal that involved deep injection of hazardous waste. And for the last 25 years or so, I've been an environmental consultant, mainly in the Hudson Valley of New York. And so I've been following the fracking issues closely since about 2008. And as I mentioned, I'm a member of the Independent Oil and Gas Association of New York. I'm not compensated for any of the work I do like this for public outreach.
Thank you.
My name is Tom Shepstone. I'm a planning research consultant. I come from Homestead, Pennsylvania, which is right near the New York border. I do a lot of my, actually a little bit more of my consulting work in New York State than Pennsylvania. And I've done a lot of work representing municipalities, developers, various interest groups, and so on. I'm also a landowner with a lease to a gas company, myself, which I would like to see developed. It's not developed yet. I work closely with a number of landowner associations. I spent some time consulting with Energy in Depth for about 2.5 years, and I now have my own blog called naturalgasnow.org, where I am a very committed advocate to developing natural gas because I believe it's essential to rural America, particularly the rural Northeast. So that's my background.
Hi, my name is Scott Krakowski. I'm from the town of Maine, just outside of Binghamton. So did my undergraduate work on the other hill at Ithaca College. I represent the Joint Landowner Coalition of New York. The JLC is a group of landowners of about 70,000 acres, 70,000 members with 1 million acres of unleased land. So obviously I represent many interests that want to move forward with drilling in New York. I also represent Jennifer Huntington. She is the dairy farmer in the town of Middlefield. Many of you are probably familiar with the Middlefield and Dryden cases. Jennifer is a woman who sued the town of Middlefield because she thought that her rights were being taken away by the town. That's a case that we will argue at the New York State Court of Appeals this spring. And while many times I will agree with industry on some issues, like for instance that the SGIS should be completed and we should be moving forward in New York, I don't always agree with industry. I represented over 200 landowners against Chesapeake when Chesapeake extended their leases on grounds of force majeure, and we were successful in federal court by having all of those leases released and terminated. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tony Ingraffia. I'm the Dwight C. Baum Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Cornell. I've been here for 37 years. For 25 of those years, I worked with the oil and gas industry on research and development related to drilling, fracking, and pipelines. I'm also a licensed professional engineer in the state of New York, and as such, and as a professor of a land-grant institution, I've been engaged in informal public education like this event for over 4 years. I'm also president of Physicians, Scientists, and Engineers for Healthy Energy, a not-for-profit. And I promise that all the data, all the information that I attempt to convey to you tonight during this debate will come only from peer-reviewed publications done by independent scientists and engineers, or directly from official gas and oil industry documents. Finally, I declare no conflict of interest, despite what some bloggers have alleged. I have never, nor will I ever, accept any form of personal remuneration for any activity involved in this issue.
Hi, everyone. Is this on? Microphone on? Yeah. Okay. My name is Sandra Steingraber. I am a distinguished scholar in residence at Ithaca College in the Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences. My academic training is in systems ecology, which is that branch of biology that shares the most in common with economics. In fact, the words ecology and economy share a Greek root. The word oikos means household. My own research and writing examine the ecological determinants of human health. I have a special interest in understanding how chemical exposures early in life can alter pathways of development in ways that raise the risk for costly health problems in later life, such as testicular cancer. My interest in the dangers of shale gas began actually here at Cornell in 2009 when I was invited to a conference on fracking sponsored by Cornell's program on breast cancer and environmental risk factors, which then was housed at the vet school. I have no conflicts of interest. My conclusions based on the scientific evidence for harm have certainly led me to action. I am a co-founder of New Yorkers Against Fracking, which is a statewide coalition. I am also a member of Concerned Health Professionals of New York and serve as the science advisor for Americans Against Fracking. In all these capacities, I have called for a ban on fracking in New York.
Greetings. My name is Walter Hang, and I live in Ithaca. We're on top of the Marcellus Shale, and beginning in 2008, I began to become interested in this issue of shale gas extraction. For 12 years, I ran the Toxics Project at New York Public Interest Research Group. And my specialty is I compile government data from various agencies, and I analyze the data, and I wrote reports regarding whether or not the laws designed to protect public health and the environment are indeed being enforced. And so when this issue came up and the state of New York said we've never had, any problems, I decided to trust but verify that contention. And so I basically have been documenting contamination problems associated with oil and gas extraction in New York State for the last 4.5 years. But most importantly, I've been very, very involved with organizing citizens to address the shortcomings of the supplemental generic environmental impact statement proceeding. And because no final SGIS has ever been adopted, not one shale gas production well has ever been fracked in the state of New York. So thank you for all of your help.
Come up and do a quick explanation of the format so everybody understands what we're doing, and then the traditional flip of the coin.
Alright, so the debate is going to consist of 2 parts. In the first part, we're going to ask all the participants 3 specific questions. Sam is going to ask them 1 question. One side is going to get 4 minutes to reply to that question. The other side will then get 4 minutes to make its case, and then either side will get between 1 minute and 2 minutes to respond to what the other side said. We're going to have 3 questions like this. The questions will address the impact of fracking on the local environment, on human health, on the economy, and on climate change. In order to decide which side gets to go first at the first question that we ask, I'm going to toss a coin, and because you guys are closer, I'm going to ask you to call. Last time, as some of you remember, I messed up this coin toss. This time I got a coin from England, which I think is easier to toss. Who's going to call? Okay.
Heads.
Heads it is. Would you like to go first, or let I answer this?
Who's question number 1? I'll let you decide. I'll go first.
Okay. Okay, I'm just going to project these questions out so everybody can hear them. No need for a microphone for me. The first question is, what are the effects of fracking on the local environment and human health?
Thank you. My opinion is that fracking, or hydraulic fracturing as the process is properly known, in combination with horizontal drilling, makes it possible to heat this campus, this community, this nation, and this world with everlasting impact on the environment while improving human health. And I have some data I think that verifies that. First of all, nothing delivers so much energy for so little impact on the land as fracking. Coal is a polluter, as we know, a big polluter. As a matter of fact, this campus has moved away from coal for that reason. We also know that solar and wind involve, well, they're good. I've represented wind companies, by the way. They involve storage issues, transmission issues, and also they need backup because the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow on schedule. Not to mention the fact that they involve the mining of rare earth minerals in China at great risk to people who live there and do it. But let's talk about the benefits that exist from a health standpoint, particularly. New York City, for example, has been on an aggressive program to reduce the amount of number 6 oil that is used in that community, and coal, to produce their energy from steam. As a result of that, the sulfur dioxide levels in New York City, as a result of this campaign, are down 69%, and soot is down 23%. New York City estimates that's saving 800 lives per year. And it's also reducing emergency room visits by 1,600 per year as a result of that very aggressive program to convert to a cleaner fuel oil and more often to natural gas. Also, Rochester has a similar experience. Rochester has reduced its SO2 from 53%, and its particulate matter is down 43% as a result of an aggressive campaign. Connecticut is now pushing, because Connecticut has just done a plan which says they'd like to see more natural gas use. They're very blunt about it, and they point out that the regional emissions are 34% below the CO2 cap for the region that they're within as a result of natural gas. I'd also go to foreign countries. The city of Dhaka in Bangladesh, for example. They are now pushing, because of their severe air pollution problems, they are pushing to switch to CNG, compressed natural gas vehicles, and they're, again, doing it very aggressively. And they estimate their program has already saved 6,000 premature deaths annually as a result of it. We also have a study done by a center in the UK, run by a physicist from California, who is Mr. Muller, and he has produced a study that shows that compared to coal, shale yields a 400-fold reduction of particulate matter 2.5, PM 2.5, which is the biggest pollutant, basically, there is. He also indicates a 4,000-fold reduction in SO2, a 70-fold reduction in nitrous oxides, and a 30-fold reduction in mercury. Now, those are huge, huge, huge benefits that come from switching from coal to natural gas. And I would point out that we're doing a heck of a lot better job of it here than they are in Europe. We always hear Europe held up as the example of how it should be done. The fact is, Europe is now reversing some of its positions. I shouldn't say reversing. They're putting it at neutral on their renewables campaign. They moved a little too aggressively. And in fact, they've now had to build coal plants. Germany is now using more coal than it did a few years ago. More coal. And we see the same thing in China, of course. We see it in other EU countries. The fact is, we should be working together because this is an opportunity to work together with renewables and natural gas to improve the health and the environment in a tremendous way. The natural gas is not only a transition fuel, which is often said, but it's a complement because it provides the backup and the stability that you need in any energy system in order to be able to employ renewables effectively. To give an example, the best use of solar is not in big solar farms, which are incredible land disturbances, but it's the best use is putting them on rooftops, obviously, and having them as an ancillary source of energy. And when you do that, you need a backup to do it. Natural gas is the logical backup because it's the cleanest of the fossil fuels. And even the greenest of buildings still need that. So let me wrap up by just pointing out there are several other health benefits I'll get into in a probably rebuttal. But my position is that fracking is improving the health of the community wherever it takes place, and that includes the Barnett Shale, which has had a long history.
Thank you. Four-minute response from the other side.
So this was the key question that I sought to answer when I began my work 4.5 years ago. Quote, what are the effects of fracking on the local environment and human health? So the issue is that in New York State, we're not allowing Marcellus shale gas fracking until there are adequate safeguards. And that's how come there is a moratorium currently in place. So what I've been doing is going through local government data, New York State data, to answer this question. And it's very clear that there are enormous problems associated with fracking. So New York State has had more than 10,000 what are called conventional gas and oil wells that have been drilled in decades gone by. So this is where you typically drill down to a pocket of gas. But most of those wells, according to the Independent Oil and Gas Association, 90% of those wells are fracked. So fracking has been going on, just not horizontal shale gas fracking in Marcellus Formation. So based on the available data, number one, there have been recorded just in Chautauqua County alone, which is where most of the oil and gas extraction has been conducted in recent decades. Literally hundreds of examples of problems where contamination has flowed into public water supply wells. There have been fires, there have been explosions. People have not been able to live in their homes. This has been documented for literally decades. This is from the Chautauqua County Department of Public Health. You can get all of these government data that I've compiled at toxicstargeting.com. You can review them for yourself, and it's very straightforward. This is an example of a well that was being drilled. It was called the Dale Fox well, and they hit a pocket of pressurized gas. The gas came blasting up out of the borehole, and then it got into a fracture. It went 1.5 miles, literally in seconds, and it contaminated 12 homes. The people had to run for their lives. Their wells got polluted, and there was actually litigation, and they were paid a settlement. One of the most amazing examples of a family that actually got reportedly impacted by fracking is a family in Andover, New York. It's called Dave Eddy. You can see a video interview with him. And you can see from this document, U.S. Energy actually admitted that they polluted his well. They admitted that the family had to run for their lives when the gas from a fracking event across the street impacted their home. And they actually indicate that they tried to pay off Mr. Eddy, and he wouldn't agree to a settlement. This is the Perkins family, and they're holding up pictures. They live near Bolivar, New York, and a well was being drilled nearby, and oil actually contaminated their water, including their toilets, their washing machine, their sinks. Their son was actually taking a shower when the oil blasted out of the shower head and covered him in oil. That problem was never cleaned up. It still does not meet applicable standards. I checked the information this morning. When you drill and frack a well, you generate this very, very high-level contamination called brine. And so traditionally, this brine has simply been dumped in pits. They're all over western New York where traditionally gas and oil has been extracted. These were supposed to be outlawed more than 25 years ago. They're still in common use. I checked the status of this spill. Again, it doesn't meet applicable standards. It remains administratively active. This is another example. You can see the brine is just dripping into an impoundment. You can see all this weathered oil. These are very, very common. This one was interesting because it actually had a discharge. You can see it completely denuded this hillside and drained into a small creek. So these are common practices that really should have been outlawed decades ago. And so I'll leave it at there. Thank you so much.
Now for the 2-minute response.
Well, there's no doubt that there have been spills associated with the oil and gas industry in New York over the last 30 years or so. However, as I mentioned, I'm a groundwater geologist. I've been an environmental consultant for the last 25 years in New York, and I've spent my career really cleaning up and investigating spills a lot like that. Just a little bit of context for Walter's statistics. He's talking about several hundred spills that occurred over a period of about 30 years. During that same 30 years, approximately 300,000 spills were reported and investigated and remediated in the state of New York. So a few hundred spills out of 300,000, I would say, is hardly an epidemic.
Let me just add too, I debated Walter on this before, and the only thing I'm going to say is, if you want to know the other side of this story, of the incidents he talked about, go to the DEC website. If you can't find it there, write to me, I'll give it to you. DEC wrote up a rather lengthy rebuttal to Walter's claims. And it's very detailed rebuttal, so I would encourage you to do that. Also, I would point out that the frack pits or wastewater pits, brine pits as he described them, those are something that are not going to be allowed under the new regulations that are being proposed in New York, and they're not being used in northeastern Pennsylvania at this time by the operators that are operating there. So I don't see much to that.
Are you all set? Okay, great. Your response, 2 minutes.
Rule number one, regarding the DEC's rebuttal of my original findings, I wrote them back. So if anyone wants to come down and look at the letter, I'm happy to share it with you. Number two, the bottom line is that even the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency said that the proposed environmental and public health safeguards that the Department of Environmental Conservation developed in 2009 are totally inadequate. They told them to start all over again. And when the revised draft was submitted, they basically submitted even more comments. The bottom line is that even the Department of Environmental Conservation's own executive deputy wrote a very detailed memo that ultimately got his commissioner, Pete Gratis, fired. He basically said, we can't safeguard public health. We've been cut so brutally, including the Division of Mineral Resources, that we just don't have the wherewithal to basically regulate this industry. And in fact, that's documented in their own annual reports. This is an unplugged and abandoned well that's been leaking. They know about these problems. They've never been able to deal with them. They've documented literally thousands of these wells that have leaked. They have no money to clean them up. They need hundreds of millions of dollars. The bottom line is that fracking has impacted public health and the environment. There's no dispute about that based on the government's own information, and that's how come we don't have fracking in New York State, because we're waiting to get adequate safeguards.
I would like to add that our worthy opponents would like us to think that the experience in New York over the last 30 years will be representative of shale gas development, which is not happening in New York, but which has been happening in our sister state, Pennsylvania, for the last 5 or 6 years commercially, where there have been about 4,000 wells fracked, about 8,000 wells drilled, and the data is in. Over 1,000 letters have been issued by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection in response to complaints by landowners, by churches, by schools, of water contamination. Of those, 160 have been determined to be causative. That is, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection declared in a period of 5 years, with only 4,000 wells fracked, that 160 individuals had lost forever the use of their water wells.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Question number 2. And this time we'll start with the other side and we'll rotate that way. So question number 2 is, what are the local and national economic consequences of hydrofracturing?
Fracking is inherently dangerous to human health and to that part of the environment, namely water and air, on which long-term economic vitality depends. And to be clear, I'm using the word fracking here as a shorthand for the whole process of shale gas extraction and all its ancillary infrastructure like compression stations, flare stacks, and waste pits, because you can't have fracking in the narrow sense with all the other infrastructure going along with it. And as such, fracking carries with it many financial risks that can and do incur ruinous costs to communities. First, there's less recoverable gas in the ground than originally claimed. Here in the Marcellus Shale, the U.S. Geological Survey itself drastically cut estimates of how much natural gas is contained in the bedrock from 410 to 84 trillion cubic feet. In other words, instead of 16 years of U.S. consumption at current levels of natural gas use, the shale beneath our feet could only provide 3.3 years of gas. And that fact alone means that the economics of fracking are necessarily boom and bust. The profits will be scooped up by members of my generation, leaving New York's children with only a toxic mess, shattered bedrock, no recoverable gas, and no extraction-related jobs. Even if we discount future economic prosperity and stick to the here and now, studies in other states have shown that gas industry's promises for jobs creation have been overhyped by a factor of 8, actually, short-lived, and have largely benefited out-of-state workers. Second, fracking jobs are toxic jobs. Because silica sand is an agent of fracking, silica dust is released in great clouds at the job site. It's like asbestos. Silica dust is a known cause of lung cancer as well as silicosis, which is an autoimmune disease that is both disabling and progressive, meaning that even after exposure ends, the disease will worsen along with the health care costs for workers. Head injuries, silicosis, and other chronic diseases caused by toxic exposures on the job site add costs in the form of workers' comp and long-term disability that are ultimately borne by all of us. Third, air pollution in the form of smog accompanies fracking wherever it goes. So in contrast, Mr. Shepstone to claiming that fracking is the cure for air pollution, it simply transfers air pollution from our urban areas into our rural areas. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has identified fracking as the leading source of smog in otherwise pristine areas such as northern Utah. Many economic consequences follow from smog, especially here in New York, which is the nation's #2 wine-producing state and the #3 dairy state. Ground-level ozone, which is what smog is, inhibits the growth of both grapevines and alfalfa, which is the mainstay for hay. There's also costly economic consequences for smog, which is definitively linked to asthma, stroke, heart attack, and low birth weight. New York State air is not starting from a pristine baseline. We already suffer ozone alerts in summer. Fracking in New York will make bad air days worse. If we make bad air days worse, we New Yorkers will suffer more strokes and heart attacks. Our children will have more asthma. Nationally, the childhood cost of childhood asthma is $18 billion. Even a small uptick in childhood asthma rates would add costs to our Medicaid and public school system. Asthma is the leading cause of school absenteeism. Every child with asthma incurs thousands of dollars in direct and indirect medical costs each year. And we've already seen in Texas an uptick in child asthma in intensely drilled areas. Emerging data show elevated rates of birth defects in fracked areas of Colorado, increased risk for low birth weight among infants born to mothers in heavily fracked areas of Pennsylvania. These are all terribly expensive problems whose monetized costs need to be projected. Fourth, the economic consequences of fracking take the form of social blight. Sociological studies show that when fracking arrives in a community, so too arrive increased rates of crime, prostitution, drug use, drunk driving, rape, homelessness among families headed by single mothers. These are all expensive problems to mitigate. The costs are largely borne by local taxpayers. Fifth, given the hazardous nature of fracking and drilling operations, there is inherent conflict with mortgage and property insurance. In homes where drinking water supplies are ruined by fracking, home values plummet. Even absent contamination, proximity to drill sites scare off buyers and mortgage lenders, and so undermine the economic vitality of our real estate industry. Thanks.
Response?
First, I'd really like to note that missing from this panel is the DEC. The DEC has been completely absent from this discussion now for quite a long time. The letters they were referring to were written years ago, but they're completely out. And the concept that we're really holding off because we're doing more studies, many of us disagree with that. Most of us believe that we're holding off because Governor Cuomo has decided that for political purposes, it just doesn't make sense for him to move forward right now. So we need to do the next best thing. We need to look to other experts in the country because our state has really been silent on many of these issues. Our president is one who has talked about this issue, and as many of you know, our president is wholeheartedly in support of moving forward with natural gas development in this country for many reasons. He just said in the State of the Union address that natural gas is the bridge fuel that can power our economy with less of the carbon pollution that causes climate change. So when we talk about health effects from all of our different energy sources, our president believes that if we can reduce our carbon emissions, we will reduce the number of health impacts in our country. Stephen Chu, our former Secretary of Energy, said just last year that that is the case, that we can not only produce jobs and economic benefits, but we can also do this in a safe manner. So how does natural gas development power our economy? According to an IH study that was issued just last September, the average American household saw an additional $1,200 in disposable income in 2012. That happened because our energy costs are coming down through the use of domestic natural gas. More than 2.1 million United States jobs are supported today. $284 billion was added to the United States GDP in 2012. According to the Manhattan Institute, between 2007 and 2011, per capita income in Pennsylvania rose 19% in counties with over 200 wells. New York income in counties with Marcellus Shale would rise 15% or more over the next 4 years if the state's moratorium were lifted. Now just imagine, wouldn't it be nice if all of us had a 15% raise? But that's the potential that we're talking about. And this isn't just theory, this is what is happening across the border. Really, my office is in Belleville, New York. It's 10 miles away. I see it from my own eyes. We see it in terms of people coming up to do their estate planning and financial planning all the time. People who have never had wealth before, they're coming into us. The story that I like to tell the best was a woman who was about to receive $1 million, never had anything in her life, and the very first thing she said is, please plan so that I can give 10% to my church and 10% to local charities. That story is being repeated in Pennsylvania over and over again. And that has an immense local impact on the economy. Last year in August, the White House reported that the oil and gas boom has substantially reduced our country's trade deficit. Imagine that. When have we been able to do that? Through the first 6 months of 2013, the petroleum deficit is on pace to set a new annual low. The White House reports that economic news like this is just one more reason for us to celebrate the resurgence of domestic oil and gas production. On October 4th, Hillary Clinton said that U.S. is on track to surpass Russia in domestic oil and gas production. According to Hillary Clinton, that's good news. What that means for vital manufacturing and industrialization in this country is enormous. These are not my words. This is our former Secretary of State. Governor Corbett, in his 2014 energy plan just released last month, the title of the plan, Energy Equals Jobs. His state efforts give business a competitive advantage because energy costs have now been reduced in Pennsylvania by 40% compared to what they were in 2008. And I can tell you, in the economy that we are in now within this world, cheap, inexpensive, clean energy is what wins the day. And that's what natural gas is doing to our country right now, this boom in production and domestic production. And with regard to imports or exports, Governor Corbett says that if the U.S. were to export 8 billion cubic feet of NLG per day, liquid natural gas, it would boost employment by over 300,000 jobs and gross domestic product by up to $57 billion by 2005. Locally, my community is in extremely bad shape. No one is staying in my community, but we are seeing tremendous impacts from this benefit. We are seeing the Windsor compressor station, for instance, school taxes have gone down in Windsor by 5%. My school district, we have lost 40 school positions, 40 teacher positions because of layoffs. That doesn't have to happen. Thank you.
More to say when eventually we talk about the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room called climate change. Our worthy opponents seem to think that everything they talk about being a benefit from increased fossil fuel production has no limits, has no constraints, has no impact on the largest problem we face, which is not unemployment investable. It's global human health. There are constraints. The very same documents that they cite, if you read further, point out that if we take more than 1/3 of the fossil fuels still remaining in the ground, out of the ground, and burn them and emit them, it's all over from a climate change point of view. So yes, if you want to financially benefit somebody, decrease their fuel cost. Sun doesn't cost anything. Wind doesn't cost anything. Falling water doesn't cost anything.
Scott mentioned that he thinks that the governor is, through political means, holding up fracking. That's actually not true. The title of this is, Should We Lift the Ban? There's no ban. There's only a moratorium if you want to participate in a generic environmental impact statement proceeding. But I'm sure Scott knows that any firm that wants to come to New York to get all that shale gas money could initiate an individual environmental impact statement proceeding, and they would be welcome to give it a go. So the firms voluntarily said in 2008, we're going to wait until the final S-guise is completed. That's how come there's no shale gas fracking now. But that's pursuant to what's called a generic proceeding. If they want to do an individual EIS, or they want to come to a community and give it a whirl, I think a lot of the people in this room are going to be ready to talk to them.
On the issue of the generic environmental impact statement, the DEC has told the industry, don't bother. We're working on other things, we're not going to make that happen. On the issue of the length of time that we will have energy in this country from natural gas and domestic production, President Obama has said over 100-year supply is what we have in this country. And on the issue of health impacts, the one statement that you can look at that has come out from our state is an order from our Public Service Commission that talks about the health impacts in New York City because of their use of heavy fuel oils. Our Public Service Commission says that the health impacts will be tremendous if we are able to reduce that use of heavy fuel oil and convert to natural gas. There's a PowerPoint presentation online. I urge you to take a look at that. It's the one authoritative piece that we've ever seen from our state, and it's right on health impacts in New York City.
Yeah, I just want to mention two things. Tony mentioned that we have a worldwide health problem, and yes, we do. And it's PM 2.5. Read up on it. Read the Mueller study, and how many people are being killed worldwide by that. That is tremendous, and this is solving that problem. And I would just say one other thing. Sandra mentioned the low birth weight study in Colorado, and here's what the state says about that. The state's name was on it, by the way. It said, the findings showed only association, not causation, and the statistical differences in birth defects were minuscule. So much for that.
Okay. Thank you. I want to remind the participants to, the best they can, to use the microphones. Sorry. Okay. I was trying to signal that, and I hope I didn't speed you up. Okay. So we're on to the next question. Okay, the final question before we get to the Q&A. I know that the audiences in the past have always asked really good questions, so please stay for that exciting part. But the third question is, what effect is expanding fracking likely to have on climate change? And we'll start on this side.
Well, in my view, the climate benefits of natural gas are overwhelmingly positive. It's almost hard to overstate. It was only really just a few years ago that there was universal acceptance that natural gas was the welcome bridge fuel, the transition fuel that would take us to a low carbon or no carbon energy future. And I know that a lot of that thinking has begun to change over the last few years. I'm probably one of the few people, maybe in this room anyway, that still feels like it is still the strategic fuel that we need. But even if you're not sure or you've changed your mind on whether natural gas is an important bridge fuel, I think we probably can agree that it's important to retire as much coal-fired electrical generating capacity as we can. And that's one of the things that natural gas has already begun to do. Just 5 years into the shale gas revolution, it's already replacing coal-fired electrical power generation in this country. In the past 5 years, coal share of electricity generation has declined by 11%. Since 2010, 50 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity have been retired. And between now and 2020, just 6 more years, another 50 gigawatts of coal capacity will be retired. The Energy Information Administration projects that by 2020, coal power generation will supply only 39% of the nation's electricity. Right now, it's about 48 or 49%. And one of the reasons it's happening so fast is that we don't have to invent any new technologies to generate electricity with gas. In fact, a lot of our power plants are already equipped with the ability to burn natural gas. In fact, the U.S. could reduce its carbon emissions by 20% simply by utilizing the existing gas-fired capacity that's already installed on power plants. Tom mentioned that there are synergies between natural gas and renewables. So if you want to see a transition to renewables, to low carbon and zero carbon energy sources, natural gas actually accelerates and makes possible the development of renewables like wind and solar. Natural gas is able to provide flexible power, flexible baseload power to back up those technologies, and it probably is the only baseload fuel that really can fill that role. If we're going to do something about climate change, we're going to have to do big things. And the big things that really are the policy of this administration are natural gas, burning more natural gas, certainly renewables, possibly nuclear power expansion, but also carbon capture and sequestration. And carbon capture and sequestration can also be helped by natural gas. If we convert more of our coal-fired plants to natural gas burning plants, it has a much simpler, less complex emission stream. It's easier to separate the carbon dioxide from those stack emissions and to sequester them under the ground. So natural gas plays that role also. And a quick word about methane leakage. A lot of people have come to suspect that natural gas may not be the cleanest fossil fuel source, but I disagree. Although there is some methane loss during production and during transmission in our natural gas systems, the estimates are that the total loss is something between 1% and 2%. And if that's the case, then natural gas is still clearly cleaner than coal for both production and for combustion.
Thank you. On the other side.
What effect is expanded fracking likely to have on climate change? In a word, huge. Like everybody here, I take fracking to be the shorthand for the entire life cycle supply chain process of getting oil and gas out of shale. Since last year's debate, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has begun issuing its 5th report. The IPCC is the consensus science from thousands of atmospheric, social, and agricultural researchers. It is not blog science. It is the best available data, information, and understanding that humans can bring to the important issue of climate change. Among the most recent key findings of the IPCC are these two. 1, the impact of methane emissions on climate change, that's called the global warming potential of methane, is again found to be much higher than previously thought. The global warming potential is the scientifically accepted manner of converting methane emissions to equivalent CO2 emissions. Second most important finding, we will reach the 1.5 degrees centigrade warming warning period in 15 to 20 years. The latest IPCC pegs the global warming potential of methane at up to 86 times the warming potential of carbon dioxide over those crucial next 20 years. For example, our federal government currently must by law use a global warming potential of 21. That was the scientific consensus in 1996 and applies only to the 100-year period. So when the president and the oil and gas industry claim that carbon emissions have decreased over the last few years, they are using outdated science in converting methane emissions to carbon dioxide equivalents, and they're hoodwinking the public into thinking that we have 100 years to worry about the problem. Also, since last year's debate, the EPA has issued new rules for controlling some methane emissions from well sites, but only natural gas well sites, and only new natural gas well sites, and not on the 20,000 new oil wells that also produce gas, or on the millions of existing oil and gas wells that are already drilled and producing in the U.S. Operators in the DOE expect 20 to 40,000 new wells per year over the next 20 years. And the EPA has revised its budget for methane emissions in the U.S. and now reports that the oil and gas industry is the single largest emitter of methane in the U.S. Also, since last year's debate, there have been many peer-reviewed papers published on actual measurements, not estimates, not guesses, actual measurements of methane emissions of oil and gas operations across the entire supply chain. Every one of these peer-reviewed papers, every one are much higher than industry claims and the EPA has estimated. These papers are being written by independent scientists working for NOAA and from many prestigious universities. These papers consistently support what a paper written from Cornell University in 2011 predicted. The most recent of these peer-reviewed papers, which measured methane emissions over much of our country, concluded, and I quote, "The US EPA recently decreased its methane emission factors for fossil fuel extraction and processing by 25 to 30%. Those were based on estimates as a result of negotiation with the oil and gas industry." I continue the quote, "But we find that methane data from across North America instead indicate the need for a larger adjustment in the opposite direction." So, to summarize, over the last year, since the last debate, we have learned that the effect on climate change of methane emissions is higher than we thought. We've learned that there's more methane emitted than we thought, and that we are on a path to the tipping point, the crucial tipping point of 2 degrees centigrade in the next 30 to 40 years. And yet, still, the industry and all the above energy policy of our federal government is accelerating us towards that tipping point. Thank you.
Well, I would just like to point out that I don't believe Tony's estimates of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions necessarily took into account the fact that from now on, most shale gas wells are going to be completed using what are called green completion technologies. And that is that there won't be any more venting, there won't be any more flaring of natural gas when a new well is brought into production. And so that will further reduce methane emissions that are part of the life cycle emissions for natural gas. Also, there really is a growing body of statistics showing that the life cycle greenhouse gas footprint of natural gas is something like half that of coal. University of Maryland, Carnegie Mellon University, MIT, the National Energy Technology Laboratory, and others have all agreed that the life cycle greenhouse gas footprint for natural gas is far, far less than that of coal.
I'll just add, Tony acknowledged that the EPA adjusted its estimates downward. Now, he's got studies, he says, that prove the opposite, but the EPA concluded they should adjust it downward based on the evidence that they got. And I think that's the key point. The EPA believes that they had overestimated it, and there's also been studies from the University of Texas and other places indicating the same thing. So I just did not accept that. I think there's been a lot of criticism of Tony and Bob Howard's work on that. I don't want to get into that too much, other than to say that some of that criticism's come right here from Cornell. So it's not universal agreement on this issue. And the green completions is something that's been underway not only in anticipation of the regulations, but voluntarily. Companies in Texas have been doing it now for probably 8-9 years. And they're doing, I think it's Devon is doing it, it's been doing it 8 or 9 years, if I remember correctly. And they're doing 100% of their wells are green completion, so.
Thank you. And now the response.
The two rebutters missed the key point. The key point is the difference between a measurement and an estimate. The EPA does not measure methane emissions. Carnegie Mellon did not measure methane emissions. Nettle did not measure methane emissions. Professor Cathell did not measure methane emissions. Professor Howard and Professor Graffia did not measure methane emissions. All of the published peer-reviewed independent research on actual measurements have occurred in the last 9 months. And let me repeat what I said. Every single one of those reports says that methane concentration has increased, not decreased. It's higher than we thought it was. I'll repeat the quote if I have to. That was by a government agency, NOAA, saying that EPA's guesses were wrong. The measurements show the guesses were wrong. They were going in the wrong direction. So let's make sure we're talking about science and not guesswork. Our paper from 2011 was guesswork. But we now have data. We have science. And we were right.
Exciting part, questions from the audience. But I want to compliment all the panel members on a very civil debate up to this point. So, Michelle Wang, the Vice President of the Cornell Forensic Society, has a microphone, and when you stand up and you want me to call upon you, she'll run over with the microphone. And Kirat is doing the same on that side of the auditorium. So is there anybody with a question? Way in the back there, Michelle, here.
Is it on? Yeah,
yes.
There we go. I thank you for running up here with that. I wanted to find out, given that we seem to have some disagreement here between reports from government and industry agencies, in some cases anyway, and scientific findings in other cases, regarding all of the issues that we talked about, whether it be global warming, economic impacts, environmental impacts, or health impacts. I mean, I don't want my house to end up being worth a lot less. I don't want my health to disappear. And I don't want my community ruined. And I don't want the world to have major problems in the long run. We find here that if we want to have any kind of certainty as to what we can do, we need to be able to believe in what's actually being proved and what isn't. And if we're not going to be able to come to that kind of agreement, I want to ask, what can we do in the meantime? My understanding from what I've seen, and I've worked in the science of some of these things in the past myself, as well as the economics and the community impacts, my impression is that we should not be doing natural gas drilling the way it's being proposed and being done in many states around the country now. for all of the reasons that we just heard today. But I'd still like to hear, if we're not going to do shale gas, which I'm hearing from the, what I'll call the left side of the table to be our salvation here today, what can we do that's going to save us in the future?
Thank you. Okay, why don't we start on this side and then go to that side? So why don't you focus on this side start first? Go ahead.
Well, just on the early part of your comment, I think I want to address first, and that is I think there has been a lot of confusion. I think people, the public in general, has been maybe confused and sometimes alarmed by the lack of certainty. There's a lot of coverage of hydrofracking, but there never seems to be any certainty about whether it's safe or whether it's not safe. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, but one of the things I'd like to just say, and I think maybe we can even agree on this, is that the media has a tendency to report new studies when they come out, which is their job, they should do that. But often they're reported in a very superficial way, as if this new group, this new research paper, this new finding is the final word. And it very often is not. In fact, it almost never is, because the nature of scientific research and inquiry is that you don't get the last word just because you publish a new paper. And so the science is iterative, it's step by step. And I think that while that's the way it is done, and that's the way it should be done, it sometimes leaves us less than satisfied. And so anyway, that's my comment on the first part of your comment, and I'll just shift the microphone down.
Okay. I just wanted to add a couple of things. One is, you raised the question of, what do we do? Well, that's a really appropriate question, because you can't bury your head in the sand and pretend we don't need energy. This building is probably heated with frac gas. That's the reality, folks. And you have to get used to that. That's the reality of what's happening. And if you think that there's problems, go see for your own eyes. I'll take you on a tour of Demick. I took some people yesterday. And I'm happy to show them. I'm happy to show them that it's not what they've heard. And the other thing I want to point out is one of the reasons for the confusion. We heard two people on the other side say they're using fracking as a short-term or shorthand for the entire process. Now, why is that? Well, the reason is that they've tried to, Josh Fox in particular, tried to pretend that fracking is something new and mysterious, and that all these chemicals and all this stuff is something terribly dangerous and new. But they can't convict that. And there is not a single case in this country where the hydraulic fracturing process has polluted a groundwater supply. Not a single one. And that is a fact. That is a fact. And when you hear people saying that things have been polluted, what they're talking about is dragging in everything else. They're dragging in if there's a spill someplace. They're dragging in if there's some kind of other problem with produced water or something like that. All this stuff has to do with the fact that what they're trying to do is have it both ways. They want you to think it's new and mysterious and needs to be regulated for that reason, and they're simultaneously trying to tell you it includes everything that we've done forever.
Thank you. Does the opposition have a response?
Yes,
we do. Gee, Tom, it would be nice if we could just frack without everything else. But we don't. But I want to just answer the question that was asked. If not shale gas, then what? And I promised you I'd only refer to peer-reviewed science. And I was lucky enough to be a co-author on a paper that appeared since the last debate that answered that question for New York. We published a paper in Energy Policy about 8 months ago that said, given today's technology and given today's pricing structure for wind, water, and solar, it is perfectly feasible, technically and economically, to convert all of New York's energy uses, transportation, heating, and electricity generation, to non-fossil fuel sources by 2030. We lack only legislative, regulatory, and governmental willpower to do so. And since this is a democracy, and you control all those things, do it.
Why is it that the oil and gas industry needs to have exemptions at the federal level, environmental exemptions? It needs to have the ability to hijack land in New York through compulsory integration. The law, like 15304, the termination of a mineral lease, is biased in favor of the oil and gas industry. Why all the special treatment so that this industry can exist. The rest of us have to play by the rules. Why not you guys? And how does a 40-page lease get around federal law and state law? How does it really protect?
Thank you. I think we understand your question.
I'll answer it very quickly, and then John wants to add something. First of all, the industry is not exempt from the Clean Water Act. They require permits all the time. And if you want a good explanation of how it works, I would invite you to view a video that I posted on my site recently from Tony Ingraffia in Nanticoke in 2010, where he says there is no Halliburton loophole, and he explains it, I think, explains it very fairly as to how this comes about. And there's numerous permits required under the Clean Water Act for what the industry does. So it's a misnomer to say that there's an exemption. And that's the point I want to make. I'll turn it over to John.
Yeah, I really would strongly disagree that any energy company in New York, if hydrofracking is ever allowed, is going to get a free pass. The state of New York for decades has had some of the strongest environmental regs on the books to protect our air and groundwater. And the supplemental generic environmental impact statement that's in progress, has been in progress for 5 years, if it's ever implemented, would only add to that very strong environmental regulatory framework we have always had in New York. The permitting process would be about the most stringent in the U.S. for hydraulic fracturing. And so I really think that you don't have anything to worry about as far as getting a free pass from a regulatory compliance or enforcement standpoint here in New York.
Thank you. A response?
Yes, Tom, I'm glad to hear that you're listening to some of my thoughts. But what I was trying to explain to the public back then, that the reason why the Halliburton loophole isn't a loophole is that it was always there. It was just a confirmation with the word explicitly included in the Energy Act of 2005, the word exemption of clean water, clean air, Safe Drinking Water Act. It's literally there. It's in federal law. All that law did was to confirm what was the general understanding between the oil and gas industry and the federal government. So it is a fact. It remains a fact that oil and gas is the only industry in the United States that is by federal law exempt from federal regulation according to the Safe Drinking Water, Clean Water, and Clean Air Act. It's a fact.
I wanted to note that the federal government essentially doesn't grant gas extraction permits in New York. They're all state permits typically. So there are two key exemptions in New York that we're fighting very hard to overturn. Number one, you can take that gas drilling wastewater and you can inject it back into the ground for production purposes. So that exemption basically allows the industry to pump this toxic contamination back into the ground. Normally that would not be allowed were it not for this exemption. Number two, there's an exemption for hazardous waste. This is a specific state exemption. So these two exemptions, you're absolutely correct. They completely change the economics of gas drilling and shale gas fracking because you can dump, in effect, the gas drinking wastewater. That's one of the critical concerns that is holding up adoption of a final SGICE because we have so many thousands of scientists and citizens who are very, very intimately aware of all of these regulatory shortcomings, and that's how come we've been pounding the governors now for 4.5 years, and that's how come we don't have it, because we're very, very knowledgeable about these matters.
Thank you. Do you want to say something as well?
Well, I just want to put a finer point on the exemption issue. So there are these federal laws, right, the big laws, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, and so on. And to say that fracking has an exemption is correct in that it has exemption to key provisions within those laws. For example, if you dug a hole in the ground through a drinking water aquifer and wanted to pour a proven human carcinogen down that hole, that would be illegal under the Safe Drinking Water Act unless you are fracking.
I just want this other side, because this is a nice give and take, so I'm going to go with the flow here.
Let me just add quickly, because it's so hard for me to understand this discussion in terms of being a resident of New York State, thinking that we're not already overregulated, and we are. Lisa Jackson is the former EPA administrator, and she has spoken to this issue, and she has said the states are doing a good job regulating. And our state is in the process. They're certainly taking into account comments that Walter and others are making. They're taking into account comments that we are making. But to think that we're not being regulated or that the industry is going to get a pass on this issue, that's just never going to happen in the state of New York.
All right, I'm going to go on to the next question. Yes, you.
Given that high capital costs for current alternative energy makes it unattainable for many rural communities, why should we discourage the transition to less harmful natural gas instead of being forced into a dichotomy of staying with heavy polluting coal generators or switching to expensive alternative energy, putting major economic pressure on low-income families?
I'll let this side respond first.
Well, I disagree with the premise of the question that it is lower polluting. Essentially, natural gas is not less polluting than coal or than heating oil. It's just a shell game as to where you want your emissions to go. Diesel fuel and heating oil are basically the same thing. So you can decrease the use of heating oil and swap it out with natural gas in New York City. But when it takes thousands of diesel truck trips to get the natural gas out of the ground and into the pipeline in the first place, you're simply transferring those emissions to someplace else in the state. Upstate New York are the lungs of all of New York State. The westerly winds blow, prevailing winds blow west to east, and so by transferring the emissions and smogging up upstate New York, not only do you raise important public health problems here, but you also then, as the wind blows, you bring them back to downstate. So that's not a solution. Similarly, even though natural gas has no mercury in it as compared to coal, it has the process of extraction brings up out of the shale many heavy metals in the drill cuttings, which then end up being dumped in landfills in a completely unregulated way, and so threaten drinking water. So we could still have just as much exposure to heavy metals, it just comes in a different form.
Great. In response?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think part of the answer is that by definition, we are talking about a transition. Nobody is thinking that we're going to flip a switch tomorrow and convert our economy to something that doesn't use any fossil fuels. So we are talking about a period of decades, maybe a couple of generations before you can switch over to a very low or zero carbon energy future. Tony mentioned that by 2030, that under some idealized scenario, you would be able to stop using fossil fuels. But 2030 is still 16 years away. So again, even under the most ideal scenario, you're talking about a couple of decades before you could switch to a significant amount of our energy production from renewables.
A couple of years ago, the Cato Institute had an article that talked about how much space would it take if you use windmills to fuel all of New York City. The answer was the entire state of Connecticut. That's what's necessary, and everyone has to understand that. It's a massive use of property to use the windmills. And just yesterday, the Wall Street Journal published an article about what's happening in Europe and in Germany. Right now, this was yesterday, the European Union and German government announced separately that they were rolling back aggressive subsidies and mandates for renewable energy. The reason? Staggering costs have led into billions of dollars in debt. They have a tariff deficit thanks to excessive renewable energy subsidies. The costs right now are tremendous, and what's happened is that they can no longer be competitive on the world market because their costs are so high. That's not to say that we shouldn't be moving in that direction, but we have to understand that if we're going to compete in this world, right now, that is not the answer alone. It has to be a combination, like the President has said, it has to be an all of the above strategy.
And I just want to give the other side a chance to respond because they look like they wanted to say something.
Yeah, I appreciate the question also, but I also don't think your premise of higher costs for renewables is correct. I'm quoting from a peer-reviewed publication. Wind is currently the cheapest source of electric power in the United States today. Excuse me. Wind is currently the cheapest source of electric power in the U.S. today. The 10 states with the highest fraction of electricity from wind saw the cost of residential electricity go up only 3 cents per kilowatt hour over the decade 2003 to 2013. All other states went up at least 4 cents per kilowatt hour. Hawaii went up 17 cents per kilowatt hour. In case you don't know, Hawaii imports petroleum for all of its energy uses. So you also mentioned rural community. Last I looked, Ithaca was a rural community. We have a community scale wind farm under construction. We have solarized Tompkins County. We will have thousands of homes in Tompkins County with solar panels on their roof in the next few years. And I agree, nothing's going to happen overnight, but we can't wait until 2030 to start. Thank you.
I just want to
Okay, I'll give you a response and then we'll move on to the next
Okay,
question.
all right. I just want to, I think you made a beautiful point about the renewables, because I've represented wind farms, and I've stood in front of an audience this size that was all angry at me because they thought I was promoting wind power on their favorite mountains. That's the that's the reality, folks. You know, the people who oppose natural gas will be out opposing wind farms. It will happen. It happens every time there's a wind project proposed. There are people who come out who are opposed to it for the very same reasons. And this is the problem with the 2030 plan, is that it's not the economic part of it so much. Although I think that's huge. I don't agree with the subsidy numbers at all. But again, the reality is that it's the political problem, not the economic so much. It's the political problem, and you can't ignore that.
Okay, great. We're going to have another question. That gentleman right to your right, you're at.
I want to address the right side of the table, because you mentioned earlier about how you think that industry is currently overregulated and it doesn't need to regulate more. And if what you said before that about fracking not having any impact on water is true, then I guess we don't need to be regulated. But if it does have an impact, how is any less regulation a good thing under any scenario?
I'll tell you what, as a landowner representative, I'm not asking for less regulation. All I'm suggesting is that when I hear people say that the industry is getting a pass, it's just not true. That's not the reality of what's happening in New York. But we want to make sure that our farms are protected. And I'm working with people that are third-generation dairy farmers, and they absolutely want to be certain that their lands are going to be protected. And I'll tell you, when they hear someone from New York City telling them how to handle their land and that they're not going to care for it properly, they get offended by that. So the landowners absolutely want to make sure that there are good protections in place. We have an SGIS that has a great plan. It was set to come out in Labor Day of 2012, and frankly, for political reasons, it got put off.
Great. Response on this side? Yes.
Just on the nature of regulations, obviously I'm not for regulated fracking either, I'm for banning it. And that's because their regulations work when we can decrease risks and harms to the point that's acceptable to all of us, right? Which is why we regulate things like infinite car seats and airbags and so on. But some things we have decided as a society are simply too dangerous to be regulated. In my mind, fracking falls into that category for many reasons, mentioning only one here, is that cement, which is what well casings are made of, is not an immortal substance. Cement cracks, it shrinks, it does very well with compressive forces, but not with torquing, and it can easily, when there's a small seismic activity, crack. And so we are thus laying time bombs in the earth by drilling down into the shale, pumping it full of carcinogenic materials, and thinking that that material, cement, is an immortal barrier that will forevermore protect the drinking water that lies above it for generations to come. There's no regulations in the world that can make cement last forever.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Thank you. This gentleman right here with his hand up.
Mr. Kurkowski insists that the gas and oil industry is not getting a pass. And yet he has not addressed the issue that was brought up by this gentleman just a moment ago, which is the redistribution of private property by the state of New York to foreign companies like Norse Energy in the guise of compulsory integration. We're talking about the seizure of 40% of landowners' land. I too am a landowner, And I don't want my property used to produce natural gas. I don't want to expose my family to the consequences of that kind of extraction. And I should have the right to say no. But the industry is getting a pass. I don't know how you can say that they're not.
This is an issue that I speak about in New York, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, and in Texas. And it's because the rules are different in these states. And when you look at all of the rules, you have to figure out which is really the best plan. And there's no perfect plan, I will tell you that right now. But here's what happens if you live in Pennsylvania. You can make that decision because there is no forced pooling. There's no compulsory integration in Pennsylvania. But because of national drilling, they can drill around you, which means you will have all of the burden of what's going on around you and none of the benefit. New York has decided that that's not right because in states like that, in states where there's strictly rule of capture, the industry can come in and they can steal your gas and not compensate you. Now, if they are drilling in New York, there would be no surface activity on your property whatsoever. That's part of the compulsory integration process. They can go under 4,000 feet, a mile, they can do that. I agree. They can put a pipe under, but you know, the DEC has come out in the SGS and said there has been no lateral migration from those laterals ever. And on top of it, there's no lateral migration in terms of the fact that there are fluids in the rock that have been there for millions of years, and that's not coming up. So when we just look at it in terms of what the choices are, you know, this tends to be the better choice of all of them. Now, the other choice might be, let's stop all domestic activity whatsoever. And then this gets us back to whether we're ever going to have energy independence in this country. We've been at it for quite some time. And we have all of these roadblocks that are being thrown out there, many that are being suggested here in other parts of the state, more so in New York than really any other state. I view New York as the biggest threat to energy independence in this country right now, because we have the ability to shut this down. If we're going to move forward out of this gridlock that we're in, we have to have these alternatives. My children are not going to see cleaner air if it's only renewable energies today. They will not see cleaner air in their lifetimes.
Okay.
But
we have to move on. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay. Would you like to make a quick response to that?
I would, yes,
Okay.
please. Energy independence, energy security are totally different concepts, but very important concepts. One has been mentioned, one is not. The only sure way for any country to be energy independent, that means it doesn't need energy from another country, is to produce all of its energy at home. All countries can be energy independent if they produce energy only from renewables, because they own them. We own the sun, Russia owns the sun, China owns the wind, India owns water. If you want to be energy secure, that means you don't have to fight for somebody else's energy. So energy independence and energy security are the trump cards for renewable energy. The only way that our children and our grandchildren will see the U.S. energy secure and energy independent is when, in their generation, and it will happen in their generation, we're using only renewables.
Okay. Walter, you want to say something?
These are very overarching issues. They're very complicated. As I said, I'm just here because I'm a resident of Ithaca. I would love to hear more about the entire planet, the rest of the country, but the main thing is I care about New York. And so recently I was driving near Ovid, South Geneva, and this is an area where there's been a lot of traditional gas extraction in decades going by. And I was shocked that recently, evidently a lot of wells have been abandoned. This is where a woman in South Geneva got impacted reportedly by fracking. Chesapeake Appalachian paid for a water filter, and when I was driving around, I could see that there were a lot fewer wells. And so I actually checked into this with the Department of Environmental Conservation's own data, and as you know, these traditional, conventional wells play out. They produce for a while, and then they fizzle out, and typically they get abandoned. So it turns out that between 1989 and 2012, the amount of gas being produced in New York is at now a 25-year low. It's dropped enormously. And it's the same thing with oil. A lot of these little wells are playing out. And last year, based on the DEC's own data, they only issued one conventional gas well permit for 2013. Now these data are a little tricky because new data might trickle in and blah, blah, blah. But the bottom line is, the whole rest of the country is, really going hog wild for fracking. It's in 30 states now. America is now the largest oil and gas producer on the planet. But here in New York, we can actually halt fossil fuel extraction if we can maintain the fracking moratorium for a few more years. So I believe also that Governor Cuomo in August of 2012 was ready to go, but he got cold feet. He required the Department of Health review, and that review is now tied into the Gordian knot because of people like you. So for the first time, we're requiring these very knotty environmental and public health problems to be resolved, and that is not going to be done quickly.
Right, thank you very much. And we're out of time, unfortunately. We've already went over time. The security that we hired is very angry at us. But I would like each person to give just a 1-minute sort of closing statement, what they want the audience to take away from today's debate. So why don't we start on this side with you, Walter, and work our way down this way. And we can alternate. How about that? That seems even fairer.
Governor Cuomo is going to make the decision on whether or not to allow shale fracking in New York State. Right now, he's not doing it. He's running for re-election. Bird dog him every place he goes. Go after him. Go to toxicstargeting.com, click on Marcellus Shale. Sign the coalition letters. Be active. We have an opportunity once in a lifetime to basically safeguard our state. We're the only state in the nation that has that potential. If we can get rid of these regulatory exemptions, make sure that we don't get harmed from shale fracking, then it can be replicated from coast to coast and all across the world. If we get screwed, everyone else probably do.
Thank you.
I think the best policy, both at the state and federal level, would be to put forward policies that accelerate production of natural gas and thereby accelerate a transition to a lower carbon future.
Thank you. This side.
Objective evidence shows that when you look at the consequences for health, environment, economics, climate change, fracking is a net negative for New York. And if all the evidence seems to be accumulating slower than the pace that drilling and fracking operations are rolling out over the rest of the nation, I think it's for two reasons. First, the gold fever rhetoric that surrounds the rush to drill has oversold the benefits, underpriced the costs, and overlooked long-term risks. And second, the industry itself has cloaked itself with secrecy, legal exemptions, and non-disclosure agreements that have impeded objective academic research. So science, though, is finally beginning to catch up to the tempo of drilling. And so of the 150 health studies on fracking that are now published in the peer-reviewed literature, half of them have just appeared in this year. And they make one thing clear, that the risks that the gas companies are required to disclose to their investors in their 10K forms, and those disclosures clearly describe leaks, spills, explosions, blowout, property damage, injury, and death. Those turn out to be real-life problems, and science is finally beginning to catch up, and the data are now emerging. And those problems make further investments in fracking foolish and unethical. Fracking turns water into a poisonous club to smash rocks apart. That is a Neanderthal technology. If we can store data in iClouds and carry around whole libraries in our pockets, we can surely direct solar power to run those devices rather than blasting fossil fuels out of the ground and lighting them on fire, and New York can show the way. Fracking brings temporary profits to a few and permanent ruin for many. There is no place for us for fracking in New York. New York's future is unfractured.
Governor Cuomo is showing the economic death knell of the state, and particularly upstate New York. Root County just had an 8.7% sales tax decline. You think that doesn't matter? You think people aren't suffering driving up through here? If you get outside of the area of Ithaca here and look at it, you'll see it's Appalachian. It's Appalachian. And that's a real issue. And we're sitting here, some of those panelists down here live in natural gas heated homes. Frack gas is heating or keeping them warm this winter. So you can talk all you want in hypothetical terms, but you got to get back to reality. And one thing that's perfectly clear from what we heard tonight from the other side is it's not about the scientific process of hydraulic fracturing. It's not about that at all. You didn't hear hardly anything about that. What you heard is how bad the fossil fuel industry is. And if you think it's bad, and you think we can turn it all off at once, you're sadly mistaken. Get real. Thank you.
Boo. 3 brief comments. Appalachia is Appalachia because of fossil fuels. That's what's the Point number 2, let's consider turning the current moratorium in New York into something like, let's make New York State, for the purpose, for our children and our grandchildren and future generations who will need natural gas, certainly not the Frankensteinian way it's being put on the ground now. Let's turn New York State into the world's first strategic natural gas preserve. There's no reason to take it from New York right now. It's make it a preserve. And finally, climate change is the issue for all of us, and I would beg all of you to begin at home with conservation and efficiency and local generation, and then move to your communities with community-scale solar and wind, and then move to the county with county-wide efforts, and all the way up to the state level, and eventually to the national level. We can do it. It's going to take 10 or 15 years, but we can't wait 10 or 15 years to start. It has already started. Renewables are growing at the fastest rate of all energy supplies in the United States. Keep it up.
Final comment?
So I think you can see that the 2 sides of this table are probably never going to agree. And the arguments were great on both sides. I commend all the speakers today because they were all very knowledgeable and spoke well. But we're not going to agree. And this goes back to my point that we need to have the DEC, we need to have the state authority on this issue start weighing in on this. For now, what we look to is our national leaders. And our national leaders are telling us that we should be moving forward. Whether people in this room like that or not, this is what they are saying. Our EPA administrator is saying it's safe. Our former and our current ones, our Interior Secretary, our Secretary of Energy, are saying we should be moving forward with this process. Keep in mind that all energy has an impact. There is no energy that we've talked about today, none that's in existence, that doesn't have some impact. That's just the fact of life for all of us, and we all have to make sure that we understand that. When we look at the health impacts, make sure you think about what the health impacts are of poverty and unemployment. And what are the health impacts of sending our young men and women into harm's way to protect our foreign interests in other countries?
Oh, come on.
And I hear groans from that, and I honestly don't ever understand why I hear a groan, because apparently those groans come from people who believe that's an unfair argument. I used to see people in our community who had signs in their front yard that said, "No blood for oil." They've traded those signs for no frack. You can't have it both ways. This is something that is an immense opportunity for our country, and we have to move forward with it. This will benefit all of us in generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank you all for coming. It was a very civil debate. I'm glad the police didn't have to jump into action. And I'd like to invite both sides to congratulate each other on a great civil discourse.